for our keynote speaker. We have decided to organize in such a way, so to have at the beginning, if there is still some question to the single speaker, and then to have a general discussion of some of the different topics that arise from the very good presentation that we had today. So, is there any additional question to one of the speakers? If not, I've tried to identify some of the common points and also some of the challenges that we have in front, having as the final target the expertise for the future. And the first one, I think, is a general consensus view that we have to foster the leaders of food safety, and this means also to have an effect on the capacity building of national and supranational organization and systems. So I think that we can all agree on this. But then how we develop this process? We have seen that can be approached from different ways. And so my first point is multidisciplinarity. There is a recent paper on Nature that says, the title is Multidisciplinary Matters. And it's a message to hard scientists to take in consideration social and human sciences. However, I think it's been highlighted by more than one speaker that we not create a super expert. We cannot create a super microbiologist, toxicologist, nutritionist, which is also able to communicate very, very well to all the audience and to manage the crisis. So how would you think that we have to, what set of competencies we have to introduce in a single course?
Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent question. The modern problems in society and modern professional problems require a flexible, a creative, but a professional approach that can no longer be addressed by a homo universalis. We need to have a multidisciplinary view. So I think the key thing that any training, whatever, if we're talking about a toxicology training, a medical training, veterinarian training, anthropology training, all of these issues matter in public health. So the thing they need to have in common is they need to be competent in working with other disciplines. They need to be open in sharing experience and being able to link to professions that maybe currently do not yet even exist.
I guess everything was said already, and I fully support your opinion on that. And I think this is one point. One point is that we cannot create universal genius people, but we can stimulate teamwork among single experts that are trying to understand each other, and they are promoting the knowledge of each other. And the next point is regarding education. We should try to make some harmonization across Europe of these courses that are already offered. This is very useful and also helps in getting accredited degrees from one or the other university. It would be helpful, especially for the experts, not to consider only single cases of national relevance, but they should also consider global perspectives and also that the fact that cases do not stop on the border of a country. And this, it would be helpful that those experts get trained on an international level.
I think it is really important to develop multidisciplinarity, but also interdisciplinarity if we're going to be able to deal with today's wicked problems. And I think it is about moving beyond knowledge recall to developing creativity, as you said, but also critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, all these kind of generic skills which are actually much more important than subject matter. And I think it is about also developing the kind of skills in terms of really harnessing the power of digital technologies and using them appropriately.
Thank you. I think the idea of generic skills is a very important point. I wanted to make a comment, I guess, about the the spread of backgrounds across the world. So most of the presentations that I heard today were about education for people who already have some scientific training in food sciences or toxicology, and then they go on to a master's or a PhD and so on. But you have to remember that that's fairly, and I say this with the utmost respect, that's a Euro vision of things. If you live in my part of the world, in Southeast Asia, you'll find that many of the regulators, the people in regulatory authorities, do not have a science degree. Some of them have a degree in English, for example, in China. So they're struggling even with English. They don't have scientific backgrounds, and so there's a need to start at the very beginning to develop these generic skills and then move up. So I just wanted to make that point, that we're all sitting here, we all have very high educations, but there are many people in the world, not just in Asia, but also in the South Americas, who do not have the same skill bases that we have, but still all have to do a risk assessment and risk manage. So that's, I think it's an important point.
Yes, I completely agree with that. But I would also like to bring up the question that when you perform risk assessment, you usually need to be expert on something. You are either a toxicologist, or expert on epidemiology, or chemist, or exposure science. But then in the end, you need to be able to talk to the others who are expertise in other areas. And that's why you need to have a very strong scientific background in your own area. But that is not then usually sufficient. You need to build that. On top of that, you also need the different methods in risk assessment. And that's why we feel some people think that, okay, if you're a toxicologist, then you don't need to take a training in risk assessment because you're already a toxicologist. But in my mind, there are two different aspects of the whole thing. So you need to have both your own specific scientific background, but then be able to understand the others and work as a team, because that is really the basis for most risk assessments when they're performed in authorities.
Well, you just stolen my words, because I think multidisciplinarity is more about an expert from a scientific area to be able to communicate to another expert from a different scientific area. And it doesn't matter how many and how good the master and BSc degrees in whatever they are offered by the universities are, because we are training people that go to their jobs 5 or 6 years ago, after. And 5 or 6 years after, the challenge that we are faced are not the same that we taught them at the universities. So at the universities, we educate people and do a little bit of training, but in my opinion, the training, most part of the training is on the way during our jobs.
I agree with Mrs. Tsirakos. You know, you need excellence in your profession. Otherwise, you know, you can't be a good risk assessor. And you also have to keep in mind that the best assessor is an active researcher. Otherwise, you know, you are not able to follow the development in your field. This is one thing, and that shows you that when people working together, you need procedures. You know, I'm a German. We like rules, yeah? But nonetheless, when we have implemented our quality management system, ISO 9001, we were able to let all these people work together because the procedure was very clear. And I think this is something, you know, what you have to keep in mind. It's not the assessment as a new scientific field. It's just the way you deal with things. And I think this makes multidisciplinary approaches successful.
Okay, thank you. Now we have some questions in the room. First one on the left.
Okay, I'm Lisbeth Jacksons from Ghent University, and I'm involved in research and risk assessment and also in education to regular masters, but we also have an international training for developing countries. I've been training now about 120 people who are working in regulatory offices in Vietnam, etc., and Latin America. So what we perceive from there for all this training is that the big difficulty is really to enroll science into risk assessment. So the mathematical issues and the modeling, this is really the striking part. And I was missing a bit in all the examples. Where is this embedded on the one hand? And on the other hand, also for many people which are coming from developing countries, it's also important that they understand papers and reports like from Codex or WHO or EFSA things. So we also start from there. So maybe you could comment on this?
Okay, I would suggest to pick up several questions. Another on the right.
My name is Colton Holcomb, working at Recult in Wageningen in the Netherlands, and I'm also a member of the management board of EFSA. And actually, we have been talking about multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, but we are missing actually transdisciplinary, which is stakeholder involvement. And if we're talking about open EFSA and about the interaction of public into risk assessment, I think this is also a very important topic. So I would like to have your comment how you're going to teach actually or educate and the people that are our future risk assessors also to be able to manage this kind of interaction with the stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. Maybe some first answers and then we will continue with the question. You have the microphone. Who will start on the first part maybe concerning developing countries?
I just want to, regarding the question for the transdisciplinary approach, I think yes, it's quite important, because when people start working in a risk assessment body, you know, they are not aware of these challenges when they talk to stakeholders. This is it should be part of the training, because otherwise, you know, you run into nowhere. So you have to understand what your opponents are thinking, you know, what are their needs, and you have to balance science against all these management questions, you know, you're facing when you're talking to stakeholders. And this is a big challenge in routine, I can tell you. You know, we have routine meetings with all German associations, production, even with the church, you know, so we have many opponents, but everybody has his own view, you know, on scientific outputs and outcomes, and that makes it difficult, you know, to talk about science and to show where is the borderline between management, political issues, and it becomes very interesting when you are discussing, for example, the precautionary principle. And to say, you know, who is responsible for this? And I completely agree. This is a skill which has to be present, but we found out that we have to train the people just by doing it, to understanding the principles. And then the question for the international training, I'm very much convinced, you know, that this is the only way, you know, we can work for a global standard of risk assessment, food safety. So that needs, you know, some curricula, you know, which are a little bit more harmonized than today. But it depends always on the structure of the assessment body. We have our experiences, if you might know our EU's Food Safety Almanac from the BFR. You can find it on our website, also in the printed version. You can see that all 28 member states has different structures. So they work somehow, you know, but they're all different. So the needs are different. Sometimes, you know, you have big agencies which has both management and assessment. Some others are more located in the environment, and they all have different challenges. And so that makes it difficult to have a unique approach. So it should be more orientated on the needs of the authorities.
It's just a comment on the comments from the audience. If we have a look at all these programs we have seen today, we have to face the problem that time is limited, ECTS points are limited, duration is limited, also of the training courses. We have seen there are 2-day training courses, there are 2-year academic educational programs, curricula, and they cannot, unfortunately, they cannot cover everything. So what is very important, that after such a training, life goes on, but also training has to go on to be continued. And I would strongly encourage if we could establish something like a European training passport in food safety, where everyone taking place or attending different courses can make their records, can put in this sheet of paper the points he or she has got, or even in electronic format. Everything is then notified on this electronic food safety or risk management passport. This would be helpful to develop experienced experts.
Thank you very much. The fact that we're sitting next to each other doesn't know that we know everything about each other, and I'm learning a lot just by sitting here, and I think this is one of the values of this workshop, and I'd like to thank the organizers again for doing this. This is extremely high added value. In terms of this lifelong learning that you were mentioning, in June this year, the Management Board of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control has endorsed a training strategy for the next 10 years for professionals in infectious disease control in Europe. And that has enabled us to start a new program in addition to what we already have with the EPIAT and UFAM, which we now call, for lack of creativity, the Continuous Professional Development Program. We're still looking for a better name, so if you have some. I think this is really an important thing to link into the fact that not everyone is able to join a master's course or a 2-year course, but people who are already burdened by a professional responsibility of risk assessment of any kind, they need short courses. And I think I would fully support this kind of an EU training passport. I think this is something very tactical to further discuss between EFSA and between Ecdc, because we have so many components already together. But I see another need. Today, again, I was amazed with the richness of the different projects that the European Commission is initiating in terms of training and capacity building. But at the same time, I'm also concerned about the fragmentation and the fact that often we don't know from each other that these programs exist. So this is a missed opportunity. I think now we are entering the stage that a strong coordination at the European level is needed to bring all those training activities together. And I think this would be an invitation I'd like to extend to the Commission.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that this last point is very important. There is a nice title of a newspaper journal a few months ago, and the title was a mass of information does not equal a wealth of knowledge. I think that is more or less the situation that is the paradigm of our society. We have a lot of data and we are not able to put together to conclude something. But we have 2 questionnaires and 2 on the back.
Okay.
I will ask all from the audience, also the speakers, to be short and synthetic, so we can have more space for question and answers.
Barbara Alessandrini from the Italian National Reference Center for Veterinary Epidemiology and Risk Assessment. We are now working for the European Commission developing 10 e-learning modules on various issues from table to table, and we are experimenting a kind of engagement of stakeholders, qualified engagement of stakeholders, classifying them per importance and power to address change. What I think is that if we have to think of the expertise for the future, we have to work to build trust among professions, as you have already said, but also among stakeholders, including the public. So do you have an idea? Do you have any chance to address the issue of building trust so as to arrive to a concrete and real possibility to interact and to communicate, forgetting the approach of providing information, but establishing a real and concrete dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Al-Khreisha from Jordan, Food and Drug Administration. I'm the Director of Food Safety. I'm sorry for that, I'm not European, but I have a very excellent relationship with Europe, even at a governmental level. Jordan is one of the countries signed with Europe the comprehensive EU agreement. So we are the other side of the Lake Mediterranean. So building capacities in this issue is very important even for us, because we were asked to adopt a food law equal to yours. So how we can build capacities if all those capacities are reserved for European researchers or scientists? Science doesn't know boundaries. We have even qualified people. Why they are not engaged in such activities? Because globality is the key word. We are speaking about food safety. So please consider that. Thank you.
We have another question here, Steph. And Manuela at the end.
Thank you. My name is Birgitte Helvig, and I'm from the National Food Institute in Denmark. We have, for the last 6-8 years, been engaged with courses under the umbrella of the Better Training for Safer Food paid by the European Commission. And I'm a bit surprised that, as far as I have heard, none of you have mentioned these courses at all, because this is a huge program covering a large range of topics within that's all relevant for the European Union when it comes to food safety. And one of the things that they do, which I think is important to remember as well if you're a risk manager, is the idea is to give the risk managers an idea of the EU legislation and how it's supposed to be implemented, and in order to harmonize it throughout Europe. And at the same time also to do risk assessments or foodborne outbreak investigations or investigations on feed or imports or whatever it is. But I think it's very important that we keep this in mind as well. I know that some of it this is for when you're doing education of people that have already have an education. But has any of you had anything to do with any, or do you know in any way involved in these courses?
So, who wants to answer to these three questions?
Hi, I wanted to come back to the First Lady who was talking about her courses. I think it is really important to involve all stakeholders, increasingly so, particularly when we're trying to have much more creative and innovative approaches to how we create courses. And that's the 7 C's that I mentioned today about learning design, very much is engaged in that. So it's about getting a group of people collectively to co-design, to have a shared vision, to kind of develop, and that can include the stakeholders, which I think is very important.
I'd like to also comment the question on stakeholders and how to build trust. I think one issue is the risk assessment sciences and the new developments or the new methods in risk assessment sciences that will help to increase the transparency and also to really describe the uncertainties of the results. I'm thinking about implementing systematic review approaches, for example, and also really to assess the uncertainties. And this is one way, if our risk assessors are really well aware of the new methods and use them, that will help also in building trust, because then the output will be much more transparent, and that will also help the stakeholders to understand and trust the results from the risk assessors.
We try to respect the time.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for, first of all, to Birgitte to remind us of the Better Training for Safer Food program. Massive program. We talk about sustainability, and maybe that's in fact the way to look for that. Maybe good to add to what you already brought, Birgitte, that since 3 years now, there's also risk assessment courses provided through Better Training for Safer Food. 1.8 million euro dedicated for 800 seats for over a period of 4 years. So probably it's a very stimulating discussion. In fact, if we can think of sustainability in the future, maybe to look in that direction. A good reminder also of Mohammed to think of that we're a global village, not only think about our own needs. I'd like to bring one thing back to the panel. Actually, we learned from discussions today that it's a multidisciplinary, obviously, food science. There's few courses, I think, in food science education. So it's typically, I think, many risk assessors come from different scientific disciplines. They set up a career and then at some stage get involved into food science risk assessment, food safety risk assessment. I know that there's maybe the best long-standing experience is in the area of toxicology for risk assessment. I think there's a movement in some countries also for the veterinary education to give more attention to risk assessment. Could I ask the panel, what's your view? I believe we could do more to try to influence academical curricula and also postgraduate education from universities to get more risk assessment capacity building from the universities.
I think we can pick up still there was last in the last row. And
thank you, Manuela Tiramani, EFSA. Indeed, all the presentations were very much related to building risk assessor and risk assessment expertises. As a risk assessor, what I still feel lacking a bit, and I would like to have your view, it's a bit of a provocation, how can we be more appealing for the basic science and applied science researchers? Because we still need specificities, and without going back to the discussion we had yesterday on being pure and pure scientists, but we need risk assessor, but we need to be also able to capture the expertise of basic sciences and applied scientists. So also we have to build the other side of the coin.
There's still two questions, and then we have to close due to question of time. There's one and the other.
Bettina Grasel-Graub, Medical University of Vienna. I just would like to add that there are many more courses in Europe provided. One is at the Medical University of Vienna in toxicology and risk assessment since 22 years. And the second point I would like to add is to lifelong learning. The Eurotox has installed such a system with European registered toxicologists, and you have to reapply and prove lifelong learning every 5 years by submitting credit points, proving that you have attended conferences, etc. And I think many risk assessors are also European registered toxicologists, just to add to this point for completeness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have another one on the right, two on the left, and then we will have to conclude, to give the floor also to the EFSA staff maybe. So thank you, to be short.
Okay, I'm representing here the European Federation of Cookware and Kitchenware and similar articles. And in food contact material legislation, European legislation, it is said that sometimes companies producing food contact articles have to do some risk assessment. Okay, there are many small companies, small and medium-sized, and they have no people with risk assessment training. That is one problem. And even if they would have somebody with the risk assessment training, they get raw materials and they do not know what is in the raw material. If they have to apply a coating on the food contact article, they do not know what are the substances in the coating. How can you do risk assessment even if you know what risk assessment is? So you are here people doing risk assessment theoretically on substances, but the producers of food contact articles, they have to do risk assessment in practice when they have to make something and there are substances in it. They do not always know what's in it, and sometimes, or in many occasions, they do not have the proper training to do the risk assessment. Who can answer to that, and what is Europe going to do about it?
Okay, so maybe some answers and then the final question. Who would like to, Professor Hensel?
Yeah, for the last question, you know, sorry that I have to tell you the truth, but you know, the producer of a food contact material is responsible for the safety of his product. You know, this is the principle. So they have to provide safety products. That means, you know, they have to have the skills or the contracts or whatever, you know, to provide the right assessment procedures. And so how to do it, you know, you can look to the side of the food and feed producers. They have already implemented this. It's clear you cannot cannot have it for nothing. So you have to invest in this. This is part of the strategy of the European Commission, that you enlarge the management quality system, and that includes food contact material as well as all other non-food products. And I just want to react to the stakeholders. You know, the BFR is the end user of risk assessors. Yeah, so we employ people, but I never ever had employed a risk assessor. So I employ chemists or vets or toxicologists, you know, depending on the skills we need, because when we are working on a risk assessment, we are working on a project. So that means we have to bring people together with different skills and to add skills like social skills, IT, I don't know, whatever, you know, or social science skills. So this is something, you know, what you cannot train by itself. It has to be done in our institution, you know, just by doing. And how to come on into procedures to work together with the stakeholders. This is a very important question. We have placed this kind of dialogue or participative dialogue at our risk prevention, because we never talk about crises. But this is interesting for the stakeholders, especially how to handle crises and how to provide data which could avoid crises. This is how we attract our system of dialogue when we talk to the association. Say, please, you know, before we have a crisis, you know, you should provide us with the data of content of toxic substances or of microbes, you know, in meat and things like this. So they are interested to talk to us. And at second, the problem with the NGOs is much more difficult, you know, because for a risk assessment body, you know, you want to talk science, even if it's impure. And that makes it difficult when you are facing, for example, people like Greenpeace, Foodwatch, you know, because they don't talk science, you know, they are talking about societal developments. And this is not something, this is not the core issue of a risk assessment body, even when you communicate risks. So this, to balance this, I think that is a real challenge, because you are not responsible for the development of a society, and that needs a very strong collaboration with the ministries, you know, to find out a way which is clear and which also contains both ways, the management, the political issue, and the scientific background.
Thank you. I agree with Professor Hensel. He makes a very good point about the project team. So I think that a risk assessment is not just about a toxicologist or a microbiologist or whatever. You have a team of people in the food agency that I worked in. Every application that came from industry, we formed a project team. We had a lawyer, we had a risk manager, we had a risk assessor, we had a toxicologist, a nutritionist if we needed one, a dietitian. So the idea of a risk assessment has to be a team effort. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say is that any course on risk assessment should have as one of its elements something about the interaction between the risk assessor and the risk manager. Because those two people have to, or two groups, have to work very closely together. Risk manager poses the question has to be framed correctly, and then the risk assessor and risk manager have to work very, very closely together to get the outcome. And certainly I think that's something that should be inbuilt into any course.
Thanks. I have the feeling 3 questions that were mentioned are linked. The 2 questions about existing courses, those who are existing at the national level and those who are existing at the EU level, and the question about what is needed from staff, what is needed from academia in terms of this multidisciplinary approach. And the one thing that I'd like to say about that is that you're absolutely right. It is an omission not to have mentioned better training for safer food courses, because I think this is a key example of European added value of a multidisciplinary approach. And I think the multidisciplinary importance came across all the presentations of this morning. So yes, those European courses need to be made more visible and more utilized, but also the national courses. And what I usually notice talking to our stakeholders is that sometimes we have the feeling that if the European level is providing training, that there is a tendency, and that this is not a technical tendency among the specialists, but a political tendency to say, well, okay, now we don't have to invest money in this. Now it is a European process. And I have seen good epidemiology training programs that were existing for more than a decade disappear from member states just because Ecdc started to train epidemiologists. Or if there's a causal relationship, I don't know, but I can prove the temporal relationship. So the question is, what should academia think about that? That is, I see that those people who join our type of courses, who come from universities that have a problem-based learning approach, have a major advantage. They already think from the practical problem and not from the single discipline. And I think that would be my advice to universities, to prepare the young academics for the world out there that can only survive if you work in multidisciplinary teams and if you learn how to learn. So I think there's a lot of things that can be developed there still.
Yes, we have still 2 questions on the left. First.
Professor Baromassin, I am expert in INS panel and also professor in University of Brest, where we have a master in risk assessment for consumer. At the beginning, in 2009, it was only on food safety. But as all of our students found very quickly a work in France, several of them are in ANSES, I think that's 7 or 8. The most of students found work in cosmetic industry and not in food industry. And it's a pity for me, because food industry in France is very important, but they do not need from such students. So I have a very practical question. In Master 2, there are 6 months of lessons and 6 months of training. But it is impossible for students to be trained in EFSA because the EFSA study program is not in the good period. It is from July to December, it seems to me, and not from March to September. So it's very difficult to adapt the university program to the EFSA program. And I had one student 5 years ago who went to EFSA because it was different. Is it possible for EFSA to change its training program dates in order to welcome students from university? Because I think that I am not alone in this case.
Okay. Thank you for this request for your students. We have a last question on the right. We would be happy to pick up some students in ANSES.
I would like to come back on the remark from our colleague from Palermo in getting the jobs. I think we heard that in industry and other places there's a lot of positions for these people. But what about the European infrastructure, public infrastructure? Because EFSA is doing its work quite well, so it means that some countries will reduce their capacity and only the big countries will be able to afford their own national system. And that will be a very harm for EFSA in its system of the panels. So I would also like to have your comments how Europe should manage this issue to have enough public capacity in all the also small countries.
I would like to comment on the importance of giving opportunities for students as coming from university too, for the students to really do the applied project at different authorities like EFSA. That is really that is needed to get the right training. So both within food safety discussing now, but also other authorities, both at national and in European level. So I support that fully.
Can I just in short? I don't understand the problem of the universities having a problem in sending students somewhere anytime. I'm head of the department of biology department in Aveiro, and it's up to us to recognize that the course that is done in Germany, in Parma, whatever, has a certain number of CTS, and to develop enough flexible curricula to accommodate different types of formation that can be in different areas of the world. For example, problem-based learning, 50 to 60% of our master theses are done outside the university environment, mainly in collaboration with local stakeholders, being small companies, hospitals, NGOs, etc. That's another way of building capacity and trust between stakeholders and science. Start from the very basics.
I just was to respond to the last question. I see the tendency, that some smaller member states reduce the number of assessors or scientists which could be provided for the EFSA panels. I think this is a really bad development, and it's not yet clear, what are the consequences. The German government has strongly supported the BFR because of one reason. The EFSA is not supporting the routine politics, of a member state. It takes some time to get an opinion, and very often the opinions are not suited, to help politicians to make good politics. And when you look to the erection law of all the 28 member states, and you will find hundreds of institutions which have a mandate to help their government, it's very clear, that this is the major task of a food safety agency in the member state, is to be active, reactive in short time frames to support the good policies in the member state. I know, and I'm gluing, I'm burning for Europe, but nonetheless, this is the major task, and this is somehow in contradiction to EFSA's work, because EFSA highly relies on experts from the member states. So there is a conflict. When I'm sending my people to EFSA, they are not present in my institute, and that is it started on day one of EFSA. It could be solved, when you take it as a training issue, but at least you have to be aware that this is reality. In fact, if I would advise a minister in a member state, I would say, save your life, keep your system working, even if it's small, in a small country, but you need your experts, because otherwise, this is a big pitfall, in reacting in crisis, that you said, okay, no, I don't have any expert left, so let's ask EFSA. This is too much work for EFSA, and this is not what EFSA was erected for. And so I think you should keep this in mind, when you educate experts. In my opinion, every member state, has to look for its own needs, and it has to do the dual way, supporting their own politicians as well as the European system.
I think asking the question if countries should have a minimum set of capacity in any certain function is raising actually a political question. Because it's about autonomy, it's about competence, where the competence is, and according to the current treaties, this competence, at least in public health, is with the member states. The mandate of ECDC is to assist member states to have sufficient numbers of trained experts for surveillance and outbreaks. But that mandate, which is literal, this is a verbatim, it's very difficult to interpret, because what is sufficient? And what actually are these experts we're talking about? We don't have one case definition of what it takes for a good surveillance specialist or for a good outbreak specialist. And I think this morning we have been talking a lot about risk assessors, but I haven't seen one case definition. So it may very well have been that we've been talking about very different case definitions. So I think that is the technical component of your question. And I think if we want to answer it, we probably need to address it from both sides.
Okay. So I think we have to close. I'm sorry, because there are several other questions. There are some also arriving through the web, through Twitters, but for question of time we have to close. And I want to close just thanking all of you for your participation. Obviously all the speakers for their very brilliant participation and presentations and answer to the different questions addressed by the audience. I think that we didn't solve all the problems of the education and training in food safety, but for sure it's a very hot topic that we have to discuss in the future. Thank you very much of all of you. And obviously thank you to my co-chair.
Thank you.